Good morning. Well, we are in week 2 of our Lenten sermon series, Rooted, where we have been and will be exploring what does it look like to live a life that is deeply rooted in God's grace. Now, if you have ever been a gardener or if you've studied agriculture, one of the things that you would have learned is that as a plant grows and matures, it develops a deep root system. Its roots spread out and go deeper into the soil. And as they do that underground, something happens above ground as well. And that's that plant grows strong and tall so that it's able to withstand turbulent weather and changing seasons. And that plant also begins to bear good, healthy fruit. And the same is true for us as disciples. So over the next several weeks, what we're going to be doing is taking a look at the different characteristics, behaviors, and attitudes that belong to mature followers of Jesus. Both those things that happen below the soil and those things that happen above the soil for everyone else to see. And so Pastor Matt kicked off our series last week with a message on spiritual growth, how mature disciples are continually seeking to grow spiritually. They're continually seeking to sink their roots down deep into God's grace through disciplines like prayer and fasting and Bible study, journaling and silence. And so as we do that, as we practice those disciplines, we do develop a strong root system so that we're able to withstand whatever life throws our way and so that we produce good things with our lives. And so this week, we're going to be taking inventory of another area of the life of a Christian, and that is our relationships. And some of you may be familiar with the Alameda County study, which is one of the most comprehensive studies that was done on the correlation between personal lifestyle habits and a person's health and mortality. And this study ran from 1965 to 1999. It followed almost 7,000 people throughout those years, surveying them periodically. And they started out by surveying them on just everyday personal habits, like how much they slept, what they ate, did they exercise, did they use tobacco products, how much they drank. And over the years, as they tracked this, the leadership of the study changed hands a couple times. And from 1981 to 1999, a man named George Kaplan, a social scientist, headed up the study. And as he was looking at the data, he decided he wanted to measure something else too. And what he wanted to measure were the participants' social networks, the strength of their social connections. And what his team discovered was that the most isolated people among them were 3 times more likely to die than those who had strong relational connections. They observed that people who had bad health habits, who ate a lot of junk food, who didn't exercise, who didn't get the prescribed 7 or 8 hours of sleep at night, who smoked, who drank excessively, that the people who had those poor health habits ended up living far longer than people who did have healthy habits and who were isolated. So the people with poor health habits and strong communities live longer than people who are isolated but lived a healthy life. And so what they concluded was, in other words, it's better to eat Twinkies with friends than to eat broccoli alone. Right? Go and do likewise. Amen. Yeah, I got some amens. That's good. But seriously, though, this suggests something about the way that we as human beings were created. You know, it says something about the way we're wired, that we were created to be in community. We're wired to have deep, strong relational connections. And that actually is one of the very first things we learn in Scripture. When we turn to the creation account in Genesis 2, God has created the world and has created Adam. And God stands back and looks at Adam and says, "It is not good that the man should be alone." And so what God determines to do is to make for Adam a helper as his partner. In Hebrew, the translation is a suitable helper. And what God is doing for Adam is he's not giving him someone to sow his fig leaves and cook his apples. God is not giving Adam a romantic interest. That is not what this word helper in Hebrew means. In fact, the word help in Hebrew is a lot stronger than the way that we use it in English. What God is doing in Genesis 2 is giving Adam someone who can be his partner in building community. And so as we grow into the people that God created us to be, as we grow as followers of Jesus, part of our growth process as disciples is to develop a life of Christian relationship. Now, what does that look like? What does that mean? Does it mean that our only friends have to be other Christians? No, right? Because if we remember what we talked about last week, if the goal of the Christian life is to become like Christ, if that is our end goal, then when we look at the life of Christ, what we see is that Christ spent a lot of time with his disciples. He did, his inner circle. And for us, that might as well correlate to church people or people of faith. But he also spent quite a deal of time with people who were living on the margins of society, and people who needed to hear and experience that message of God's grace. And so last week, Pastor Matt, he shared with us this image of a discipleship pathway. There are 6 different areas of our life in which we can grow as followers of Jesus. I mean, there's probably more than 6, but these are the 6 that we'll be focusing on. And as we grow from the outward going in toward Christ, toward the cross, so that our lives become like his. And this week, we're going to take a look at one just particular section of that pathway, and that is what it looks like to live a life of Christian relationship. And so I hope over the next few minutes, as we kind of look through this pathway and what some of the steps are as we grow in maturity as followers of Jesus, you might be able to identify where you are on the pathway. And we're all at different places on the pathway. I would say probably very few people are at number 5, which is the committing stage. And so just listen and kind of take stock of your own personal relationships and your own life and maybe see where you are. So starting from the outside working in, someone who is not seeking a life of faith would be someone who might say, my primary relationships are with my family and friends, but faith is not a component of our relationship. Now, someone who is seeking God would say that I'm open to people of faith, and I may even attend church. So just by the fact that you're here today, you're already seeking, right? So now, someone who's responding to God's work in his or her life would say, I realize the need to be in a Christian community as part of my spiritual growth. You recognize that not only were you created for community, but that community is really instrumental in helping you grow in your faith. Author John Ortberg, he writes a book that is, it's a great book. It's called Everyone's Normal Till You Get to Know Them. And I commend that to your reading. It does a lot of truth-telling. And he talks about his own life of Christian relationship, and he reflects that, when I'm all alone, he says, it's quite easy to convince myself that I'm really a compassionate person. He says he can watch a Hallmark commercial and get all choked up. But I know, me too. But then he says, when I'm with real human beings, and I realize that I'd have to expend energy and sacrifice time and be uncomfortable to practice compassion, I discover I'm not really as altruistic as I thought I was. We need other people in our lives to guard us from self-deception. And what the Christian community does something unique for us. And that's that it simultaneously invites us to examine where we are in our life, just like we're doing right now, where we are in that discipleship pathway. And it also holds before us the example of Christ, his life, his teachings, where we're going. And hopefully, the Christian community will help love and accept you where you are and encourage you in the right direction toward where we're all supposed to be going, which is toward Christ. Now, we've moved from responding to following Jesus when we not only recognize the need to be in Christian community, but when we take the plunge and we commit to being a part of a Christian community, when we invest ourselves in a small group, in that formal, structured setting where people can study together what it means to be a disciple of Christ and hold one another accountable. Or maybe it's not a formal small group, but maybe it's a group of Christian friends who do that same thing, who invite you to examine yourself and where you are, and who also encourage you on that journey toward where we're going. Now, the other key characteristic of people who are following Jesus is not something that happens below the soil. It's something that happens above the soil, and that's that They recognize that their actions, the things that other people can see, impacts how other people see God, right? And so there's implications both for what's happening below the soil, our spiritual growth, our personal growth, and what's happening above the soil. And if you're at the committing stage on the discipleship pathway, this is the final stage, you would describe yourself as being regularly involved with believers and unbelievers. You invest in the lives of others, and you're held accountable. And you seek to live always so that others experience God's love. Now, this, we hope, is giving us a picture of a mature disciple. And it's really helpful to us because as we look at it, you could almost make it into a checklist. Am I involved regularly with believers and unbelievers? Do I invest in the lives of other people? Am I mentoring? Am I serving other people? Do I have people in my life that are holding me accountable toward becoming like Christ? And there's that last one. Do I seek to live always so that others experience God's love? Now, those first three seem pretty manageable, but when we get to that last one, there's one problem with that, and that's people, right? If we're honest, people are messy. People are complicated, right? And loving other people sometimes is not an easy thing. More often than not, it's not an easy thing. And so probably one of the biggest hurdles we face toward growing and becoming these mature disciples is actually our expectations of other people. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Now, how many of you have ever been to IKEA? Oh, yeah, you guys laughing. I've been to IKEA. IKEA was very good to me at an earlier stage of my life. And when you go to IKEA and go into the warehouse, there's a section in the warehouse called the as-is section. It's like going on a treasure hunt, right? And if you've never done this, maybe you've been to a scratch and dent sale somewhere else. But when you go to the as-is section of IKEA, you go expecting that the items in there are going to have some imperfections. You expect that they're going to have some flaws, or they're not going to function properly the way that they should or they were manufactured. So when this happens, you don't get frustrated or disappointed or angry when you pull open a drawer and it goes, bam. You don't, because you kind of expect that it's not going to be perfect. Or when you find a really nice looking chair for your home, and as you look closer, you notice it's got a tiny little hole in the upholstery. You don't get angry. You don't get disappointed. This is the as-is section, right? Well, guys, people are exactly the same. I don't know if you realize this, but we are as is. But so often we have this expectation when we approach other people in our relationships or in our interactions that people are going to function the way they should. People are going to say and do the things we want them to do. They're not going to have any flaws or imperfections. And you might be sitting there and saying, I know this. I'm not perfect. I know other people aren't perfect. But how many of us have gotten frustrated or angry or disappointed when someone hasn't said or done the things we wanted them to do? Yeah, I know. Me too. Me too. I like this amen. You keep going. That's awesome. I'm going to recruit you. But really, think about it. Kids, think about your parents. Do they always do the things you expect them to do? No. Now you're being good. You're saying, yeah, she does, because mom's right there. But no, they don't. Parents, your kids, do they always behave the way you hope they would behave? Spouses, think about that. Coworkers, you think about your coworkers or your siblings? No, they don't. But we're tempted to live under this illusion that other people should be perfect. And while God does call us to the kind of perfect life that was lived by Jesus, and God actually works in us, perfecting us, making us more and more like Jesus, we do ourselves and one another a disservice when we forget that God embraces as-is people and calls us to do the same. When we live our lives expecting that people are going to have flaws, expecting that they're imperfect and they're not always going to say and do the things we want, that's a game changer. Then living so that other people experience God's love becomes a much different thing altogether. And in his letter to the Romans, which we heard read earlier, the Apostle Paul is actually quite a realist about people. He starts out and he says, let love be genuine. And it starts out kind of idealistic, and he paints this picture of what genuine love looks like within the Christian community. But as we get down to verse 14, we realize, actually, he's a pretty realistic guy, because he doesn't say, if ever in the event that someone were to persecute you, try to bless them. No, he says, bless those who persecute you. It's a given, right? It's going to happen. And as we jump down to verse 17, he says, do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. People are going to do evil against you. That's what he says. People are going to hurt you. They're going to offend you. In the brilliant words of Taylor Swift, haters gonna hate. Hate, 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 hate. Right? And so what Paul says to do next is very wise. He says, shake it off. He doesn't say that. But that is one possible way you could interpret what he says. But what he does say is, if it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. And I would say that most of us have a lot more trouble with this than you might think. Because what trips us up is that little phrase, so far as it depends on you. So I'm going to ask you all a question. In our relationships with other people, in our interactions with other people, what does not depend on us? What is not within our control? Their behavior, right? The other person, what they say and do is not within our control. Okay, so knowing that, what does depend on us? How we respond, our reaction, right? The things we say and do. Simple, right? Right. Because if it were that simple, we wouldn't do things like this. And this happens all the time. I wouldn't have lost my temper, but she was really pushing my buttons. Right? Sound familiar? Or I wouldn't have embarrassed you in front of your friends if you had only done the thing you said you were going to do. Right? We treat life and our interactions with people like this. That there is an event, they do something or say something, and then automatically we respond. We treat it like that. But when we do that, there's something interesting that's happening, and that's that we're actually not taking responsibility for our own actions, our own behaviors. Because have you ever noticed that an apology that goes, I'm really sorry I hurt you, but I did, right? But it's because you did such and such. That's not an apology. I don't know if you realize that. That's not an apology, because you're not taking responsibility for the injury you've caused to the other person, for your own actions. And so what really happens when we want to change our response, if we want our response to show other people an example of God's grace, we need to think about what's really happening. And that's that in between the event, the thing that the other person does, and our response are these wickedly complicated little things we call our thoughts. Right? These things that as soon as someone does something, they go into motion, they kick in, and it could be as simple as someone's 5 minutes late to meet you somewhere, and you immediately begin to think, oh man, I can't believe they're late. Like, this must not be as important to them as it is to me. Oh, they think the world revolves around them. Oh, now I'm going to be late for my next thing, and this is just ruining my day. And you can hear yourself talk, and you can hear all the assumptions and judgments you start making about the other person. And then there's also things like, your pride and your need to be right, which none of you all have that problem, but we had a conversation about this in our house last night. But there's all those things. So let's parse out how this works. With a real life illustration that I'm sure has happened to nearly all of you. And kids, you don't drive, but you sure watch your parents drive, so I'm sure you guys can relate to this too. So you're driving down 29 in rush hour, and you are stuck in the right lane, and traffic is just crawling along. And all of a sudden, in your rearview mirror, you see this car speeding up the shoulder. Right? Oh yeah, it's happened to us all, right? It's happened to us all. And so here's what may happen. You see this and you immediately think, who does this person think he is? right? He is so entitled. I have been sitting here waiting patiently for 10 minutes, doing the right thing, and he thinks that the rules don't apply to him, right? And so these are the thoughts that start going through your head. And so what you do, your response is you tap on the gas and you speed up to get as close to the bumper of the person in front of you as you possibly can. So there's no way that person's getting in front of you, right? That's what you do. Yeah, I know. Yeah. Or maybe you think, are you kidding me? All these people have been patiently waiting, and now he's going to try to cut in front of all of them? Someone needs to stand up for what's right. And so you take your wheel and you turn it to the right, and you straddle that line between the shoulder and the right lane, because not only is he not getting in front of you, he's not getting in front of anybody. Yeah, I know how this goes. Or maybe you see this happening and you think, this guy is such a jerk. I bet he doesn't realize how big of a jerk he is. Someone needs to tell him. So you roll down your window, and as he speeds past you with his blinker on, you begin to tell him how big of a jerk he is. Now, we've all seen or maybe responded in one of these three ways, but there is another response that maybe many of us have never considered before. And that's in our thoughts, when our thoughts kick in and do this, and they say, wow, this person is really impatient. I don't know, maybe there's something, he's late for something important, or I don't know what's going on in his life, but he's got to be really hurting if he's going to treat other people this way. Something's got to be missing in his life. And so as you think this and you see him coming down the shoulder, you flash your lights, and you smile at him, and you wave him over. Yeah, It's that easy, right? Now, have you ever been further back in the line of cars and watched someone else do that? Because I have, and you know what went through my head was, what are you doing? Why are you showing this guy grace? He doesn't deserve it. Right? He doesn't deserve it. But that's grace. Because neither do we. And God just pours it out, gives us grace and grace and grace in abundance, even though we have done absolutely nothing to deserve it. And so, how we respond to the as-is people of the world, and it's not just the people out there, it's the people in here, because we're all as-is people. When they behave like as-is people, how we respond has the potential to show them the grace of God. So, back to this. Changing C, our response, requires us to change B, our thoughts. And that doesn't happen overnight. That's going to take some time. But what I would tell you is that it's not impossible. Otherwise, Paul never would have exhorted us to say, to have the mind of Christ within us. To have the mind of Christ is to allow our thoughts to be governed by the same humble and self-giving love, to allow our actions to be motivated by that same sacrificial love that puts other people first, the same love that Christ showed for the world. And there's something we can do right now, probably multiple times a day, because we always run into these experiences more than once a day. When someone does something that offends you, that is not what you would hope they would have done, and your thought process kicks in, and you start to make assumptions about what their intentions are, and you start to make judgments, and you get riled up. When you notice yourself doing that, interrupt those thoughts and ask this question: what does love look like in this situation? What does love look like in this situation? And sometimes love looks like shaking it off. It really does. If you send your spouse out to the store to get Colgate Total Gel and he comes back with Colgate Total Paste, you shake it off, which I confess is not what happened in our house last week. But I'm learning too. But in other situations, when someone has really hurt you, what love looks like might be to go to that person and to have the hard conversation and to let them know. And that's what we call speaking the truth in love. Now, the key to that is the in love part. Because you don't do this out of a desire to prove that you were right. You don't do it with a sense of moral superiority, but you do it out of a desire to restore that relationship and to repair what had been broken in event A. But let's say that you do this and you go to another person and you confront them about their behavior and it's completely non-judgmental and it's loving and they don't want to hear it. They meant what they did. Fine, right? I don't need to, and they don't want you in their life. You have done everything possible as far as it depended on you. You have tried to show love, to show grace, to live peaceably with that person. So that is what love looks like, regardless of how the other person responds. But what if you don't know the answer to the question, what does love look like in this situation? And that leads us back to last week. That's where we need to be searching the scriptures to learning and understanding the life of Christ, so that as we sink our roots deeper into that message of God's grace in Jesus Christ, it's much easier when we are firmly rooted in grace to extend grace, right? Because grace really does have the ability to change people. It changes us and it has the ability to change other people. I went to a Christian college, and one of the things I'll let you know about a Christian college is not everybody who goes to one is a Christian. They might go because it's close to home, or maybe it has an academic program that's really strong and appealing to them. Or maybe they're going because their parents made them go. So there are folks who are not followers of Jesus in Christian college. And one of my professors in my second year of school told us a story about way back in his early years of teaching. There was one of these such students in his class, and she would show up to his class every day, and in the middle of his lecture, she would sleep. She would sleep through his lectures. And he never called her out in front of other people because something told him that there was something going on in her life, that she was struggling with something. And one night, he was asleep in his apartment on campus, and he hears a knock at the door. And this is like 2 a.m. And he gets up, and he opens the door, and in the doorway is this student. And she won't look at him in the eye, but it's clear to him that she's upset. And so he invites her in and invites her to sit down. And he asks her what's wrong. And as they sat there together, she shared with him her struggle with sexual addiction. She told him the things she had done and the places it had taken her. And she was shaking as she was telling the story, but never once did she look up at him. And when she finished sharing all the things that had been going on, and she finished telling him, there was this silence between them. And she looked up, and she saw him looking back at her, not with eyes of judgment, but with soft eyes of kindness. And she said, "How can you even look at me? I'm so messed up. I'm disgusting." And he said to her, "When I look at you, I see someone who is broken, yes, but I also see a child of God. Can I pray for you?" And in that moment where he heard everything she had done and he just offered grace, she, for the first time in her life, understood the grace of God. And that night in his apartment, she gave her life to Christ. And so every day, folks, we have the ability to give one another a very precious gift. We have the ability to give one another a glimpse of the grace of God. Because whenever people see us, when they see our brokenness, our scratches, and our dents, and they still want to be our friends, that's grace. Whenever they find out that we don't function the way we should, we've done things that we shouldn't do, and they still want to stick it out with us, that's grace. And whenever people see us in all our as-is-ness, and they love us anyway, that's grace. And that is God. Amen.